Hi, welcome. Properties of operation. So what we're going to do, a lot of this is review. We're going to go through all the different types of properties. We are going to leave off one property. We'll have a lesson all by itself. But we're going to go through the basics of properties. This goes back to second grade when you started learning these properties. Some of them sound simple. Some of them are a little bit more complex, but we're going to go through all of the properties. These are found on page 367. So we have a few vocabulary words again. We have just a few lessons with a lot of vocabulary words, and then we're going to get into more of the um, types of equations and expressions. But right now we're in the lesson of lots of vocabulary words because we have lots of properties. Okay, so we have the commutative property, we have the associative property, we have the additive identity property, we have the multiplication identity property, and we have the multiplicative property of zero counter example, or the property of zero. Okay, um, these properties are things like law when it comes to mathematics. These have been proven over and over and over again, and this lets us do things to a problem to make it easier to solve. Some of them, again, like I'll go back and I'll say, oh, some of these you already knew, but there's a name for it. So the commutative property. Okay, when we're talking about the commutative property, we're talking about both addition and multiplication. And what the commutative property allows us to do is to move the numbers if you're adding. Like we know that 6 plus 1 is the same as 1 plus 6. Okay, or 7 times 3 is the same as 3 times 7. Now you probably knew that already. Okay, they use symbols too, variables, but that just means the same thing. 6 plus 1 is the same as 1 plus 6, or 7 times 3 is the same as 3 times 7. What we call this the commutative property. So when you see numbers change for adding and subtracting, you know it's the commutative property. So I'm going to put that numbers change. And we're allowed to do that. You can't do this for subtraction. You cannot do this for division, so don't try it. You're going to get something different. They're not going to be equal, but you can change the numbers for addition, and you can change the numbers for multiplication. Just flip them around, which means they retain or they stay equal. The associative property, when I tell people or think of like an association, okay, association is like a group of people. So what we're going to use in the group of people, we're going to use parentheses, or we're going to use group. And what we do in these groups is we have like numbers in these groups. And so when the parentheses change, notice it's all adding. 2 plus 3 plus 8, 2 plus 3 plus 8. But my parentheses told me, okay, instead of doing the 3 plus 8 first, let's do the 2 plus 3 first. It's still going to be the same. So this is what happens when students don't follow the order of operations and they got lucky because they happened to be doing a property and they still got it right. Well, now we still follow order of operations, but because of the property, sometimes we can change what we want to do first and what we want to do second because we know the property. It's the same for multiplication. I have 3 times 4 times 5, 3 times 4 times 5, but notice my parentheses change. So instead of the numbers change, when I'm dealing with the associative property, the parentheses change. Okay, that's how I know that it's the associative property. I look and say, oh, look, my parentheses changed. The numbers inside them changed. Oh, look, my numbers have changed. They flipped. So when you're doing these problems, that's what you're going to look at. So here, some more problems that we'll have. You have the additive or additive identity. Simple. If you add 0, it stays the same. 9 plus 0 is still 9. The identity of the number stays the same. The multiplication version of this is we multiply by 1. Okay? If you take 5 times 1, it's still 5. Okay? And then the last thing is this idea of zero in multiplication. If you multiply anything by zero, it's going to be zero. And you might think, well, that's easy. We already knew that, Mr. McCollum. We knew that if we add 0 to a number, it's going to stay the same. We knew that if we multiplied 1 to a number, it's going to be the same. We know that if we multiply a number by 0, it's going to be 0. Why do we need to know the names of these? Well, when we start solving equations, these are the tools that we're going to use to solve them. And you might think, oh, this is easy. Great, because that's what we want when we solve equations. We are going to be using ideas that are super simple to solve our equations. But right now we need to know the properties. These are all of our properties. So we need to know this additive identity property, that if we add it by 0, it stays the same. Okay, so let's get into problems. Now you're just going to have to identify these. So here's number 1. And number 1 is found on page 368. This is example number 1. Name the property that's shown. What you have to ask yourself is what is being changed, or what changed. I look at this and I see, okay, it's all multiplication, things I notice, and I see that there's parentheses, but just because I have parentheses doesn't mean anything, and I look at the numbers inside the parentheses and I see that the parentheses changed around those numbers. 25n, 25n, I moved the parentheses from one side to the other, and that's what changed, was the parentheses. And so if the parentheses have changed, then we call this the associative property of, and we multiplied, and so I'm going to put multiplication. And so that would be my answer, the associative property of multiplication. Mainly because it is parentheses that have changed. Okay, go ahead and go to your Go Formative, see if you can figure out the next one.